Tonight, Canada fires back at Trump's tariffs.
We must respond with both purpose and force.
Slapping tariffs on some U.S. vehicles.
We are very worried to put food on the table.
Shutdowns, layoffs, as stock markets slide, the worst day since the start of the pandemic. Still, Trump is unfazed.
The unthinkable just happened. Overnight, Canada and Mexico didn't just threaten, they pulled the plug. More than $103 billion worth of oil and gas flowing into the United States, gone, cut off without warning. The pipelines are empty, the ports are silent, and Washington is panicked. A $103 billion blow. Without warning, two of America's closest trade partners and energy lifelines, Canada and Mexico, simultaneously announced the suspension of all oil and natural gas exports to the United States. The numbers behind the embargo revealed the scale of devastation. Overnight, the United States lost access to approximately 3 million barrels of oil and 7 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. For years, America believed its energy dominance was untouchable, that Canada and Mexico would always supply cheap, reliable fuel, that trade agreements and political alliances guaranteed the oil would never stop. But that belief collapsed, and the consequences will reshape the global economy. But how did America's closest allies become its biggest threat? Why did Canada and Mexico kill the U.S. energy lifeline overnight? And is this the moment the United States finally loses control of the global energy game? To put that in perspective, that supply accounted for nearly 40% of all crude oil imports and over 35% of natural gas imports into the country. The annual value of these imports totaled over $103.3 billion. This wasn't just a trade inconvenience. It was an economic earthquake that would shake every corner of American industry. The automotive sector, already struggling with rising costs and declining demand, faced immediate disruptions. Refineries along the Gulf Coast, designed specifically to process heavy Canadian crude, reported they would run out of raw materials within 2 weeks. Airlines warned that fuel prices could rise by over $2 per gallon, while trucking companies began calculating how to pass skyrocketing diesel costs on to consumers. The impact extended far beyond transportation. Petrochemical plants in Texas and Louisiana, dependent on Canadian and Mexican natural gas, began laying off workers within 48 hours. Utility companies in the Northeast warned of rolling blackouts and higher electricity bills as they scrambled to find new sources of energy. And as the dust settled, it became clear this wasn't going to be a temporary disruption. If you've made it this far, you can already tell this isn't just a headline. This is a full-blown collapse of America's energy security. So, no way back. In the days following the shutdown, Washington dispatched diplomats to Ottawa and Mexico City, hoping to negotiate a reversal. But behind closed doors, Canadian and Mexican leaders made one thing clear: they weren't interested. Canada's new government, no longer led by Justin Trudeau, emphasized that the decision had been years in the making. After decades of being treated as a secondary partner, burdened with tariffs, and excluded from key trade negotiations, Canada had finally decided to chart its own course. Mexican officials echoed the same sentiment, stating that the energy alliance with the United States had been exploitative and one-sided for far too long. Both governments pointed to new trade agreements signed with Europe and Asia. Canada had finalized multi-billion-dollar energy deals with Germany, Japan, and India. Mexico had expanded its energy exports to South American and Asian markets, reducing its reliance on the American economy. The message was clear. This was not a negotiation tactic. It was a permanent, strategic shift. For Washington, this reality was devastating. No amount of diplomatic pressure, trade incentives, or promises of tariff rollbacks would bring Canada and Mexico back to the table. The energy lifeline that the United States had assumed would always be there was now permanently cut. To understand how America ended up in this crisis, one must look back at the spark that lit the fuse. The spark. It began in early February of the year 2025, when President Donald Trump reimposed aggressive tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. The move, framed as an effort to protect American manufacturing, included a 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum, as well as a 10% levy on Canadian and Mexican crude oil. At first, Washington believed Canada and Mexico would simply endure the blow as they had in the past. But what U.S. policymakers failed to realize was that the political landscape in both countries had changed. Canada's new leadership, emboldened by a growing trade partnership with Europe and Asia, refused to play the same game. Mexico, facing domestic pressure to assert its sovereignty, also decided it was time to push back. Within weeks of the tariff announcement, Canadian and Mexican officials began coordinating behind the scenes. They held high-level meetings, fast-tracked alternative export routes, and finalized long-delayed infrastructure projects to move energy resources away from the United States. The oil embargo wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was a calculated response to years of trade aggression, protectionism, and American economic dominance. By the time the United States realized what was happening, it was too late. The fuse had already burned down to the powder keg. And as America scrambled to manage the fallout, it became painfully clear that the days of North American energy cooperation were over. Washington's fatal miscalculation. Policymakers in Washington operated under a dangerous illusion, a belief so deeply entrenched that it became political doctrine. They assumed that Canada and Mexico, two of America's largest trade partners, would never have the leverage nor the audacity to pull away from the United States energy market. This overconfidence shaped every decision, every tariff policy, and every negotiation strategy. But as history has now revealed, that assumption was catastrophically wrong. The roots of this miscalculation can be traced back to the early days of North American trade agreements. Since the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement in the early 1990s, the United States positioned itself as the economic anchor of the continent. Canadian and Mexican resources, especially oil and natural gas, were seen as automatic extensions of American industry. Lawmakers believed geography alone secured their dominance. After all, pipelines, transportation infrastructure, and decades of trade history had created what they believed to be an unbreakable bond. However, this perspective ignored growing frustration in both Canada and Mexico. For years, both countries warned that Washington's protectionist policies and tariff maneuvers were unsustainable. Canadian officials voiced their discontent over unfair steel and aluminum tariffs. Mexican leaders criticized aggressive border taxes and import duties. Yet these concerns were brushed aside by American policymakers, who believed their neighbors had no alternative but to comply. This political arrogance reached its peak when the United States imposed sweeping tariffs in early 2025. The administration assumed that Canada and Mexico, despite their anger, would have no choice but to continue supplying oil and natural gas to the U.S. market. Washington officials overlooked clear signals of shifting global alliances and failed to anticipate that both countries had already begun laying the groundwork for alternative trade deals. The warning signs were there. Canada investing in liquefied natural gas terminals, Mexico strengthening ties with Asian energy buyers. But Washington's leadership refused to believe that these moves could amount to a serious threat. That blindness has now come at a steep cost. Canada and Mexico's coordinated shutdown of $103.3 billion worth of oil exports to the United States was not a sudden betrayal. It was a long-telegraphed response to years of political misjudgment. As the reality of this crisis set in, the cracks within Washington's political establishment became impossible to ignore. Divided Congress. The moment Canada and Mexico announced the shutdown of oil exports to the United States, Capitol Hill erupted into chaos. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were held. Speeches were made, and media statements poured out, but none of it led to a concrete solution. Instead, Congress fell into bitter, paralyzing division. The stakes were clear. American industries were grinding to a halt. Fuel prices were climbing by the hour. Families in rural and urban areas alike were facing skyrocketing energy bills. And yet, the very people tasked with fixing the crisis could not agree on a path forward. On one side, Republican lawmakers demanded an immediate rollback of tariffs and a full renegotiation of trade deals with Canada and Mexico. They argued that economic diplomacy was the only way to restore energy stability. On the other side, Democratic legislators insisted that the U.S. should double down on domestic energy production, calling for new drilling permits, renewable energy subsidies, and emergency fuel reserves. Caught in the middle were moderates and independents, many of whom recognized that neither approach offered a quick fix. Their attempts to craft a bipartisan solution were drowned out by partisan bickering. Every proposal was blocked by procedural roadblocks, filibusters, or last-minute amendments that turned debate into deadlock. As the crisis worsened, public pressure mounted. Protests erupted outside congressional offices. Industry leaders issued dire warnings. Voters flooded phone lines demanding immediate action. But the gridlock persisted. The very structure of American politics, a system designed for debate and consensus, had become its greatest obstacle. By the end of the second second month of the oil crisis. No legislation had passed. Emergency funding bills stalled. Trade negotiators were left without clear mandates. The White House scrambled to issue executive orders, but these temporary measures failed to address the structural collapse of U.S. energy supply chains. This political paralysis deepened public anxiety and, in turn, rattled financial markets. As Congress remained deadlocked, Wall Street began to crumble under the weight of uncertainty. Wall Street's collapse. The day Canada and Mexico confirmed their coordinated oil supply cutoff, Wall Street entered freefall. Energy stocks were the first to collapse. Major players like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Valero saw their valuations plunge by double digits within hours. But the damage did not stop there. The energy sector's crash sent shockwaves through every corner of the financial market. American automakers, heavily reliant on cheap fuel for both production and consumer demand, saw their stocks tank. Airlines issued profit warnings. Logistics companies announced layoffs. Even technology firms, whose data centers and manufacturing lines depend on stable electricity costs, were affected. The Dow Jones Industrial Average suffered one of its largest single-day drops in history, shedding over 1,000 points. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq followed suit, erasing trillions of dollars in market value within days. The financial pain spread beyond Wall Street. Retirement accounts, pension funds, and individual investments tied to these markets experienced sharp losses, wiping out years of savings for millions of Americans. Investor confidence evaporated. Hedge funds offloaded positions in energy-dependent sectors. Foreign investors began pulling out of American markets, fearing long-term instability. Credit agencies issued warning, hinting that the United States credit rating could be downgraded if the crisis continued unchecked. The panic was not limited to stocks. The bond market experienced unprecedented volatility. As investors sought safe havens, yields on government bonds dropped sharply, signaling a flight to safety amid economic uncertainty. Commodity prices spiked, often seen as a refuge in times of crisis, soared to record highs. By the end of the first quarter following the oil supply cutoff, Wall Street's losses exceeded $3 trillion. The financial sector was left reeling, with no clear end in sight. And while Washington's political leaders scrambled behind the scenes, markets continued to tumble, erasing wealth and confidence alike. The damage to America's financial infrastructure could not be undone overnight. It would take years to rebuild what had been lost, and even longer to restore the public's faith in the system. As Wall Street struggled to recover, all eyes turned back to the heart of the crisis, the White House, and its increasingly desperate attempts to contain the fallout. Gas prices explode. The moment Canadian and Mexican oil exports to the United States came to a grinding halt, the most immediate and painful effect was felt at the gas pump. For decades, American consumers took for granted that fuel prices would remain relatively stable because of one unbreakable assumption: Canada and Mexico would never pull the plug on energy supplies. That assumption is now shattered. Overnight, fuel prices surged to historic levels, forcing millions of Americans to rethink how they drive, work, and even live. Across the country, gas stations displayed numbers that seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. The average price for a gallon of regular gasoline soared past $6 in California, $5.75 in New York, and $5.60 in Texas. In rural states like Montana and North Dakota, where transportation costs are already higher due to distance and infrastructure limitations, prices surpassed $6.50 per gallon. The ripple effect was immediate. Families planning road trips canceled their vacations. Long commutes became unsustainable for working-class Americans, already struggling to make ends meet. Rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft hiked their prices, and delivery services tacked on new fuel surcharges. Even the simple act of grocery shopping became a financial burden, as every product transported by truck reflected the rising cost of fuel. Economists warned that this was just the beginning. With the loss of Canadian and Mexican oil, American refineries scrambled to secure alternative sources, often at premium prices from unstable regions like Venezuela and the Middle East. The higher cost of crude oil, combined with increased transportation expenses, created a perfect storm of inflationary pressure. Airlines increased ticket prices to offset soaring jet fuel costs. Local governments faced budget shortfalls as public transportation systems, school buses, and emergency services burned through their fuel budgets faster than anticipated. Even utility companies warned of increased costs as they relied on diesel generators to maintain service during peak demand. But while American families struggled to keep up with the rising prices, few realized that the energy crisis was about to hit them even harder in a way they never expected. Blackouts incoming. Just as Americans were coming to terms with skyrocketing gas prices, a new crisis emerged, one that plunged entire regions into darkness. The sudden disruption of Canadian and Mexican energy export did not only affect fuel for vehicles, it also destabilized the very foundation of the American power grid. For decades, northeastern states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts depended on affordable hydroelectric power from Canada to balance their electricity supply. That lifeline vanished overnight. As demand remained constant but supply dwindled, the electric grid became overburdened and vulnerable. By early April of 2025, rolling blackouts began in major cities. New York City experienced 3 consecutive nights without power in some boroughs. In Michigan, entire counties faced 4 to 6 hour power outages daily. California, already dealing with an aging grid, reported emergency shutdowns in several counties to avoid catastrophic failure. Hospitals scrambled to activate backup generators. Schools closed intermittently, unable to function without reliable electricity. Small businesses, already reeling from fuel price hikes, were now forced to close during blackout hours, losing valuable revenue. The strain extended beyond urban centers. Rural communities in states like Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky were hit hardest. Unlike large cities, these areas lacked the infrastructure and political clout to receive prioritized energy distribution. Residents resorted to stockpiling candles, batteries, and portable generators, further driving up the cost of these essential items. Energy analysts warned that the worst was yet to come. Summer was approaching, bringing with it soaring temperatures and increased electricity demand. Without immediate action, experts predicted widespread blackout that could cripple the American economy even further. As the grid faltered, another crisis was brewing, one that threatened to dismantle the entire backbone of American industry. How U.S. factories and trucking fell apart. The American economy is built on movement. The movement of goods, raw materials, and finished products across thousands of miles of highways, railroads, and shipping lanes. When the oil supply dried up, that movement began to grind to a halt. At the heart of this collapse was the trucking industry. Diesel prices skyrocketed to $8 per gallon in some states, making long-haul transportation financially unsustainable. Trucking companies that operated on razor-thin profit margins were forced to reduce routes, lay off drivers, or shut down entirely. Essential goods like food, medicine, and building materials piled up at distribution centers, unable to reach their destinations. Factories suffered equally devastating consequences. Automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio halted production as they struggled to secure parts delivered by truck. Steel manufacturers in Pennsylvania reported a 30% decrease in output, unable to afford the energy needed to power their furnaces. Technology companies reliant on raw materials from Canada faced shortages that delayed production schedules by months. The collapse extended to the agricultural sector. Farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas struggled to transport their crops to processing facilities. Refrigerated trucks carrying perishable goods faced limited availability and higher rental costs, leading to significant food spoilage and price increases at grocery stores nationwide. The American supply chain, once considered a marvel of efficiency, now resembled a house of cards ready to collapse at the slightest breeze. And while businesses scrambled to adapt, ordinary Americans were about to face the full weight of the crisis: inflation, job losses, and economic pain. With the energy crisis squeezing businesses and industries, it was only a matter of time before the economic pain reached American consumers. By mid-year, the effects were undeniable. Inflation surged to double digits, with the consumer price index climbing by 12% compared to the previous year, the highest rate since the early 1980s. Essential goods like food, clothing, and household supplies became increasingly unaffordable. The average American family saw their monthly grocery bill rise by nearly 20%. Gasoline and electricity costs, already stretched thin, consumed a larger portion of household budget. But the crisis went beyond rising prices. As factories closed and trucking companies downsized, unemployment rates soared. By August of 2025, more than 2 million Americans had lost their jobs due to the cascading effects of the energy collapse. Entire towns built around manufacturing hubs found themselves on the brink of economic ruin. Retail spending plummeted as families prioritized survival over discretionary purchases. Home sales stalled, with mortgage rates increasing in tandem with inflation. Credit card debt skyrocketed as Americans struggled to keep up with rising costs. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Consumer confidence hit record lows. Families delayed major life decisions, buying homes, starting businesses, or even having children, because of the uncertainty surrounding the economy. Despite repeated assurances from government officials, the public knew that the crisis was far from over. The American dream, once synonymous with stability and prosperity, felt increasingly out of reach. As the lights flickered and paychecks disappeared, one haunting question lingered in the minds of millions. How did it come to this? And is there any way back? Canada's master plan. Canada's transformation into an energy superpower did not happen by accident. It was the result of years of strategic planning, calculated diplomacy, and bold economic decisions. When the United States imposed tariffs and treated its northern neighbor as merely a secondary energy source, Canada quietly prepared for the day it would no longer need to depend on American markets. That day has now arrived. For decades, the assumption in Washington was clear. Canada needed the United States far more than the United States needed Canada. But as the trade war escalated and tariffs tightened, Canadian leaders began to rethink their role in the global energy market. They accelerated investments in export infrastructure, approved new liquefied natural gas terminals, and renegotiated pipeline routes. Behind the scenes, Canadian energy executives and government officials worked relentlessly to shift their strategy from dependency to dominance. The real breakthrough came when Canada sealed multi-billion-dollar energy trade agreements with European and Asian nations. Europe, desperate to end its reliance on Russian oil and gas, eagerly signed long-term contracts with Canadian suppliers. Countries like Germany, France, and Denmark committed to purchasing Canadian energy for the next 3 decades, securing their own energy futures while cutting out American influence. At the same time, Asia's 2 largest markets, China and India, wasted no time in joining the new Canadian energy order. Both nations signed historic deals to import crude oil, natural gas, and renewable energy from Canada, locking in stable energy supplies at competitive prices. These agreements shifted the balance of power in the global energy market and left Washington scrambling for alternatives. Canada's master plan worked because it was comprehensive. It went beyond oil and gas to include hydroelectric power, wind energy, and critical mineral exports needed for renewable technology. By diversifying its portfolio and expanding its global customer base, Canada no longer needed the United States as its primary buyer. It became an energy superpower on its own terms. As the dust settled, Washington realized too late that its former partner had outmaneuvered it. Canada now controls a significant portion of global energy flows, and it is not looking back. Mexico's big win. While Canada's master plan was already reshaping global energy markets, Mexico quietly executed a strategic pivot of its own. For decades, Mexico's role in the oil industry was largely limited to supplying crude to the United States, locked into the North American free trade framework. But when tariffs hit and American dependency was exposed, Mexico saw an opportunity to rewrite the rules. Mexico's energy strategy began with one bold move: nationalizing key portions of its oil and gas infrastructure. By taking control of pipelines, refineries, and export terminals, the Mexican government ensured that foreign interests could no longer dictate the terms of its energy exports. This shift gave Mexico the leverage it needed to pursue new markets. The next step was diversification. Instead of relying solely on the United States as its primary buyer, Mexico expanded its energy diplomacy, signing new trade agreements with European and Asian partners. Countries like Spain, Japan, and South Korea entered into long-term deals to secure Mexican oil and natural gas supplies. These agreements offered Mexico better pricing, fewer political strain, and greater economic stability. Mexico also invested heavily in modernizing its energy infrastructure. New deep-water ports, expanded refinery capacity, and upgraded transportation networks positioned Mexico as a major global energy player. By reducing its reliance on American pipelines and refineries, Mexico gained control over its own energy destiny. The results were staggering. Mexico's economy surged as energy exports reached new markets and prices stabilized. American companies that once counted on cheap Mexican oil now faced higher costs and limited supply. Mexico's strategic pivot shattered the old North American energy order and left Washington struggling to adapt. China's energy grab. As Canada and Mexico redefined their roles in the global energy market, another superpower moved swiftly to capitalize on America's collapse: China. While Washington scrambled to contain the fallout from losing its North American energy lifeline, Beijing executed a masterstroke of economic strategy. For years, China had been preparing for this moment. It built massive strategic energy reserves, diversified its supplier network, and invested billions in energy infrastructure across the globe. When Canada and Mexico cut off their oil and gas supplies to the United States, China stepped in to fill the void. Beijing's first move was to lock in exclusive long-term contracts with Canada and Mexico. These agreements guaranteed China access to stable, affordable energy supplies for decades, insulating its economy from global price fluctuations. In return, Canada and Mexico gained a reliable customer willing to pay premium prices without imposing political conditions. China also expanded its influence in other energy-producing regions, including Africa, the Middle East, and South America, by financing infrastructure projects and offering favorable trade terms. Beijing secured additional energy sources to hedge against any future disruptions. The consequences for the United States were severe. Not only did Washington lose access to critical energy supplies, but it also watched as China consolidated power over global energy markets. America's economic competitors now held the keys to the world's oil and gas resources, leaving Washington vulnerable to supply shocks and price manipulation. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think America can come back from this? Or is this the beginning of the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to be the first to know what happens next.